Hello watch enthusiasts! Now today I'd like to produce this month's instalment of the best value vintage watches on the market. And this month there have been quite a few interesting pieces that have come up, from an extremely noteworthy Omega Speedmaster to the real genesis of a period for Seiko, and quite a remarkable piece from IWC, which formed the counterpart to the Rolex 1019 and the Omega CK2914, which from those reference numbers you might be able to guess, and indeed from the picture you can currently see. And so suffice to say there's a very interesting mix of watches this month, which provides something curious and something innovative in whatever field you happen to find attractive in the world of vintage watches, and whatever type of vintage watch you happen to look for. The first watch I'd like to speak about is a very important one in Seiko's history, and is in fact an important one in Japanese history in terms of their watchmaking. Because this piece is a Seiko which was the first of the Japanese high-beat movement watches, and these of course form a very major part of the Grand Seiko line nowadays. But this is a piece which originates from the pursuit of higher precision in wristwatches in the mid-1960s. Because in 1966, Switzerland released their first high-beat mechanical watch, and by that I mean that it ran at 36,000 vibrations per hour, which is 5 Hz, as opposed to what was conventionally the beat rate then, which was 3 Hz, or even less in fact. And so one got 36,000 vibrations per hour out of the movement, which was very, very impressive for the period, and this innovation was Gérard Prégaud's. But Seiko soon followed with their first high-beat movement in the form of the 5740C, and this came out in 1967. And the origins of this movement came in the earlier 1960s, when they released the 5740A, which ran at the conventional 18,000 vibrations per hour. Then they released later on, a few years following that release, the 5740B, which ran at 19,800. And so with this 5740C, they jumped to 36,000 vibrations per hour and created something very, very accurate, but also with an incredibly smooth second run. And other than its high beat rate, these movements had 23 jewels and originally no date, and so one doesn't see any date versions of these watches. They also featured Diashock shock protection, and they were manually wound as opposed to being automatic. But the watch they chose to release these watches in were not watches which were conceived for the Grand Seiko line or the King Seiko line. Indeed, those movements were actually derived from these and their high beat rate. But instead they chose a line which had been running since the late 1950s, which was the Lord Marvel line. And so with this movement they released the reference 5740-8000, which formed the backbone of this high beat line from Seiko. The dimensions of these watches are in many ways rather simple, in terms of being true to their original period, and indeed in terms of being of their time, as opposed to being a modern size. So one sees a 35mm side-to-side diameter, and then a 41mm length from lug to lug. And this means the watch will fit very, very nicely in the section, and the section of the market which would fit Rolex 36mm mid-size Datejusts and Oyster Perpetuals. And so going from one of these watches to one of those, or vice versa, will be quite easy thanks to the thickened lugs on these watches. And talking of the lugs, the case design of these watches is very much of Seiko's aesthetic, with flat planes which are impeccably well polished, with these very thick bevels running around the lugs, which echo the lines of modern Seikos, in addition to an inset bezel, which is similarly polished and faceted, which protects the crystal very, very well. It should also be noted that the crown is oversized to aid the manual winding of the watch, and unlike more expensive Seikos of the period, the caseback is brushed as opposed to having any ornamentation, but this isn't really a problem because at least it prevents wear and avoids the case of a great deal of Seiko medallions on the caseback, which tended to break and become damaged over time. But you do still get a degree of ornamentation on the watch, with that 36,000 mark on the dial with Lord Marvel and the applied Seiko logo. But what I think is most impressive with these watches is the variation in dials and the care taken with them. Because one does see these beautiful styles of sunburst off-white dials with these applied indices and wonderful hands which are Dauphine in their style, but you can also get another version of the watch which is also very often seen with the gold-plated case as opposed to the steel version. And there doesn't seem to be any real correlation, but one often does see this pairing, which had a linen dial and Arabic numerals instead. And this watch was produced until 1975, but I find the pricing of this watch quite remarkable. And this is because you can get a well-maintained and a well-serviced one in good condition for between £250 and £550, making them an excellent way into the vintage market if you want something high quality and with a very interesting history and movement. although you should note that the movements do take particular specialist care to service because of their age, and also because many of the parts on these high-beat Seiko movements had to be replaced, and you couldn't simply repair them. And so it does take a certain skill to be able to repair these parts which weren't originally conceived for that particular application. The next watches I'd like to speak about are a tad more varied than the first offering from Seiko, because I'm speaking about the various options sold and available from Aquadive in the 1960s and 70s. And this is a manufacturer which to the present day does embrace a great deal of its history in terms of the way its watches look. But its historic pieces do hold a very particular part in the world of diving, because their style is just so curious in terms of capturing their period entirely. Now, in terms of the watches they've produced, there's a great variety of ETA-powered dive watches from the brand, with everything from 200 metres of water resistance to 1,000 metres in the case of some of their most professional monoblock divers. And in terms of the cases made, one sees an enormous variety, with everything from the tonneau-style cases of the period through to more jagged cases similar to those used by Omega on their Seamaster 200, and then all the way up to the Caribbean 1000 cases with that monoblock case back. But what I most like about Aquadive's vintage divers is that they're watches which allow you access to some of the most brilliant 60s and 70s dive watch designs, with extraordinarily bright dials, with sunburst effects, bright oranges, and extremely crisp and in many ways highly modern markers, but at a far more affordable price than would be the case from a great deal of other brands around that period. Because currently one sees watches from Favre-Loeber, as well as brands such as Omega, for instance, with their watches from this period with their bright colours reaching extremely high prices, whereas from Aquadive one's still able to get hold of highly serviceable ETA-powered watches, which come with ETA 2400, 2700 or 2800 movements for a very affordable price. And really, in terms of the prices these watches are available for, they vary enormously depending on the case size, the condition, and also in terms of the particular model available. Because for about £400 you're able to get a woman's dive watch, whilst for £500 you're able to get a very well-preserved male dive watch, albeit not in the most popular designs, but still an interesting piece, then up to £1,500 for something really quite exotic. On these watches you're also able to get features which simply wouldn't be available on modern watches without paying a premium. And these are details like Bakelite bezels with the beautiful bicolour style of these bezels, often with exotic colours, or simply black and white, provide contrast and also wonderful translucence, which again it just isn't seen today in the same way and in the same numbers in terms of the amount of pieces you see. Similarly, one gets the charm of older features like press-down bezels, which just add a little bit more involvement between the owner and the watch, and give you something very different to a modern dive watch, something which is perhaps less precise, less refined, less well built in terms of adhering to all the modern needs a diver would have, but in the same way is just extremely right in terms of providing you with that visceral enjoyment of a classic watch. And so this is why these watches, which whilst admittedly inferior technologically to modern watches, make a wonderful entrance into the world of vintage dive watches, when so many vintage dive watches can be so prohibitively expensive. If you look at the price of even Tudor Submariners, Rolex Submariners, the works of Omega, in addition to less well-known watches. And so this really does give you an ability to enjoy that 70s period, which otherwise you would have to look to Doxa to, which again sit in a very high price range in relation to these pieces. And another element of these watches making them a really interesting acquisition is the fact that their movements are generally ETA movements and don't tend to be modified. What this means is that you're able to find parts very easily, and really anyone who's competent and qualified as a watchmaker can service them without any trouble and without having any part supply issues, which is a real benefit when these watches cost a very reasonable price, and in many ways some of these affordable watches can be spoilt rather by having extremely high service prices, where this really isn't the case with these timepieces. The next watches I'd like to speak about are triple calendars from Movado. And Movado today is a brand which isn't really known for a great deal apart from their particular design language on their modern watches. However, if one looks back half a century, the history of Movado becomes much more interesting, because they were a Swiss brand which, in the middle of the 20th century, produced some very, very interesting designs, with a fascinating number of triple calendars, with a complication which normally isn't seen these days, and provides you with a sort of a touch of high horology at a far more affordable price. In truth, the most noteworthy of these watches come in from the 1940s, the 50s and the 60s. And during this period, Movado really made some extremely high-quality watches with this complication of the triple calendar. and the sizing of these watches is very much of the period, with case sizes between 33 and 35mm on average. And whilst this does make them quite small for modern eyes, I must say that they do give a very wonderful nostalgic element as a result of their smaller size. The cases also come in a variety of materials, but the most common materials to find them in are stainless steel, yellow gold, or pink gold. What is wonderful with these watches, though, is the variation between different models. And there was such a wide range of Movado triple calendars during this period, it's difficult to pinpoint any particular models. Though generally you will be paying less for a manually wound version, whilst these are also more common and also generally more easy to service than the models under the Calendo-matic line, where one had automatic bumper movements, which generally are seen in gold versions at a higher price. But a wonderful detail about these watches is the fact that their period is so distinctive. One sees in the 40s models a far more flamboyant case design, with styles of horn lugs, in addition to highly applied numerals and very over-the-top dials, while still retaining a base colour, which is very subtle, but a great deal of embellishment, whilst if one moves towards the 60s one sees more block colours, and perhaps a more modern design, but still something very distinctive and highly attractive. And in terms of the way these watches show their complications, it's in a very classically correct way as well. Because to show the date, one has a very interesting a central date, so a pointer date, where you have a separate hand sitting beneath the hand stack, which moves from date to date and shows you which day of the month it is. Then you have two apertures, one which shows the day of the week and the other the month. And unlike an annual calendar or a perpetual calendar, these aren't synchronised in the sense that if you reach a leap year, they won't account for it, and also they won't account for the 31 or the 30 days of the month, so you have to do that yourself. But this is possible with the pushers on the sides of the case, and certainly isn't an inconvenience, bearing in mind the fact that these watches will generally cost between £800 and £1,600 for a steel version, and £2,000 to £4,000 for a gold version, making them exceptionally good value to where their complications are concerned. But certainly their design is also very attractive, because you get a very flamboyant and in many ways extremely luxurious build, with applied indices on the dial in gold or in white metal. And of course one has the name Movado, which, whilst perhaps not meaning an awful deal to someone of the modern age, in their period they were certainly extremely revered watches and of very high quality. If you're very lucky, you can also get hold of versions with a moon phase indicator. And whilst this is a wonderful complication to have, it should be noted that with these watches, as with any, the more complications you have, the more there is to go wrong. But if you can find a version which has been well maintained and well serviced, then it's a wonderful thing to acquire for a collection. Though of course if one does get one which isn't well maintained, it can cost a great deal of money to put right, and in some cases one can't find the right parts without a great deal of searching, and so it is worth considering the history of the watch beforehand. Likewise, the dials are often refinished on these watches, and so you do have to keep an eye out for what you're actually after. Because if you're not particularly interested in the collector's scene, then dare I say, it doesn't matter too much if you have a refinished dial on the basis that you're buying it for sheer pleasure. Whereas if you are going for a more valuable example, it is worthwhile checking that one hasn't bought a refinished dial or simply a replaced dial, because this can affect the resale value if you do choose to go through with that. But certainly I think these make wonderful options if you're looking for something as a piece of history and a really wonderful looking dress watch, but you want something from a slightly different name and for a more affordable price than would be the case from other large brands, especially considering the price of triple calendars from the likes of Patek Philippe, for instance, if one looks at vintage models. The penultimate watch I'd like to speak about is probably the final and the most spectacular of the 70s Speedmasters. Now, to put some context behind this Omega, one has to really understand the origins of the Speedmaster Mark series. And I've in fact produced a video entirely about this, so I won't dwell on it too long. But suffice to say that I have a perhaps unhealthy admiration for the Omega Speedmaster Mark series. Because this is a series of watches designed in the late 60s and the early 70s, which created a new line and a new spirit for the Speedmaster after the Professional. The idea being that this watch would succeed and supersede, in fact, the Speedmaster Professional as Omega's flagship chronograph. And the Mark series has a few very notable models. The Mark II, for example, being the redesigned version of the Speedmaster Professional, but still retaining the manually wound movement. The Mark III then introducing the Lemania movement into it, which added the first automatic Speedmaster, essentially, with this chronograph to the Omega line. And that, of course, became the Omega Caliber 1040. And then one had the Mark IV, which featured a very clever and very innovative internal case that popped out of the external case, including the crystal, the movement, and the inner case, to allow the case to be changed. And this, the Mark 4.5, appears as the culmination of all of these details, because this version features the 42mm tonneau case used by the Mark IV and indeed by the Mark II. However, it also retains the Mark IV's very clever internal case, which means you'll notice that silver polished bezel around the edge of that sunburst effect case around the crystal. And that really is the mark between the internal case containing the movement, the crystal and the case back, and indeed the external case, which supported the bracelet. Other similarities can be seen in the form of the movement, because with this the movement has been moved up to the 1045 from Omega, which is the Lemania 5100, and this gives a unique layout of subdials where you have the 12 hours of the chronograph at 6 o'clock, the 30 seconds of the standard timing at 9 o'clock, the 24-hour gauge at 12, and then of course the day-date complication at 3. But crucially, this watch retains the classical Lemania use of the central minutes for the chronograph. And this means that rather than having a separate minute counter on the rest of the dial, you have a central minute counter which runs from the central axis of the dial and hides behind the second hand when the chronograph isn't running. And this gives the watch a truly distinctive look and gives it the most complications the Speedmaster in the Mark series ever saw, making it in many ways the ultimate watch in that series of redesigned Speedmaster professionals. Similarly, the tachometer is also integrated into the crystal, with it placed underneath the crystal in this black ring around the edge of the dial, which creates a wonderful uniformity of aesthetic and captures that 70s vibe wonderfully. Where this watch also becomes extremely interesting is with the case, because that external case actually comes in two versions. Now, the most commonly seen is the 42mm tonneau style of case, which I think many people would agree is the most aesthetically appealing, and which is the case which was also shared with the Mark IV, and shared the inspiration and the design of the Mark II. And this features a beautiful sunburst effect brushed effect, in addition to brushing down the sides of the case, and wonderful but very sharp polished bevels along the edge, giving a wonderful break in the tone. But you could also get another style of case, which is a TV sort of case, which gave a square form to the case, and allowed it to look even more of its era. And this means that with the use of a removable central internal case, you can actually swap between the two case designs with the same watch, which is quite a striking feature, and a very interesting one as well. And to match this, the dial came in two variants as well, because one saw either the matte black dial, which looked very much like a traditional Speedmaster dial with that high contrast white on black design, or you could go for a version which was more subtle in a sunburst anthracite, which is again more rare than the matte black, but is a wonderful piece if you can get hold of one. The notability of this watch is also increased by the fact that it is the culmination of the Mark series, having taken on all of these aesthetics, and being really the last of the interesting 70s Speedmasters to use a Lemania movement instead of an ETA movement, which was modified in these automatic Speedmasters, or of course lately the new range of in-house movements. So it really does symbolise the end of an era if one doesn't include the notoriously rare and rather unrelated Speedmaster Mark V. In some ways, though, the most striking feature of these watches is the price. Because whilst standard professionals, courtesy of their recognisable case, and the fact that people really everywhere around the world are able to recognise them at a glance as Speedmasters, will sell for in the region of £3,000 and up if you're going for one of this period. If you're looking for one of these, you'll scarcely pay £2,000 if you go for one with the tonneau case and a matte black dial, and for even the rarest of the anthracite dials with a TV case, you'll be paying less than £3,000, which is quite remarkable for something this interesting, and something which really is a collector's delight. Now, the final watch I'd like to speak about is a very interesting piece from IWC, which is arguably the most important watch historically in this video, because of its impact towards the world of automatic dress watches with the ability to have anti-magnetic properties. And to really set the scene, this watch was born in the mid-1950s, in fact in 1954, after development by the famous Albert Peloton, who famously also developed the Peloton winding system, which has become so well known in IWC watches. But this was a watch which was conceived at the same time as early Rolex Milgausses, such as the famous 6541 and my personal favourite, the 1019, alongside the slightly later release of the Omega CK2914 being their first Railmaster. And as this watch being the third piece in this lineup, this really was one of the first line of anti-magnetic watches. And this watch featured a 36mm brushed and polished stainless steel case with a far more dress-orientated design as opposed to that Rolex and that Omega. It had these separate lugs which jut out from a central circular case, and easily accessed but still snug crown placed at the 3 o'clock position. Likewise, there was no thick bezel or a lowered crystal, because this featured an unprotected domed acrylic crystal over the front of the watch, and of course this gave an extremely good view, but did make this watch more of a dress watch than something more robust. And a variety of dials were seen during this watch's production run, with some versions featuring a very simple dial, indeed the early versions featuring much smaller, more delicate indices and a complete lack of lume on the hands. Whereas on later versions one saw a large applied IWC logo and fantastic amounts of tritium around the edge of the dial and also along the centre of the hands to create a slightly more robust and a more versatile watch as a whole. But what all of these watches shared was their anti-magnetic properties, and these were found as a result of the use of a soft iron core. And so one had a dial as well as an internal case back, which was produced from iron in order to produce a shield, effectively, around the movement in case of its presence around large magnetic sources. And this would shield the watch up to 1000 Gauss, being the equivalent of the Rolex and the Omega, making this watch a very competitive watch in its day. A real standout detail about the dial, though, is that fantastic Ingenieur lightning bolt on that logo at 6 o'clock, which builds these watches as something far more than dress watches, and really as an engineer's timepiece. Where the movements of these watches were concerned, there really were two main calibers, being the caliber 853 for the no-date version, and the 8531 for the AD being the date version. And so these offered the Peloton automatic winding system, in addition to a great deal of decoration and a really interesting movement for someone who is an IWC aficionado. But I think what's most interesting about these watches is their position in the public regard nowadays. Because if one's looking for a Rolex 1019 or a 6541, you will expect to pay over £20,000 for a good example. Similarly, if you want an Omega CK2914 and you missed out on the 60th edition version of these watches as re-editions and you want to buy an original, you will be paying between £10,000 and £15,000 for a good example. And so the £3,000 to £6,000 these watches cost, and the £6,000 to £7,000 or £8,000 you'll pay for a gold version, makes them exceptionally good value if you want something of a collector's item and you're interested in these early days of anti-magnetic wristwatches. And so these watches present a really wonderful dichotomy of a 36mm case with a dress watch's dial and crown, which provides all of the classic design of the period, but still provides 100-metre water resistance, an automatic movement, high anti-magnetic rating and drilled lugs. And all this for a reasonable price, bearing in mind the historic importance of the watch and the relative anonymity of the timepiece if you wear it on a daily basis, where a 1019 or one of those Railmasters will draw a great deal of attention. And so I think, as the final watch in this video, this is a very interesting piece where history is concerned, and of course one may be concerned about wearing it every day, but it's still a wonderful piece to own, and if you are interested, it really is a fantastic option if you want to have something historical and something very interesting. And so I'll conclude the video there, but do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of my choices, and if there are any choices you would have put in instead. And so if you did enjoy the video, then please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to enjoy more videos and content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Armand the Watch Guy, out.